Welcome to the system demonstration companion video for CoSaTa, which is a constraint satisfaction solver and interpreted language for semi-structured tables of sentences. I'm Peter Jensen, an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. A quick bit about me: I largely study graph-based inference and sort of explanation-centered inference in the context of question answering. A quick overview. First, I'll give a quick introduction to the idea of combining multiple facts for question answering and using those facts to generate these sort of detailed multi-fact explanations for why the answers are correct. That whole process is commonly referred to as multi-hop inference. Then we'll very quickly look at why multi-hop inference is hard and some of the contemporary ways it's been represented. Then we'll see how sort of a new twist on an old technique can help, specifically the idea of using a constraint satisfaction solver, but one that's been specifically designed to operate over text and tables of text, and get a lot of the benefits that come from working directly with text while being robust to some of the challenges. And then finally, we'll look at the actual tool in practice, which takes the form of a command line solver and interpreter, as well as a prototype IDE. So what is multi-hop inference as it applies to question answering? To help ground this task, consider the following question, which is from the New York Regents Science Exam, a standardized elementary school question that fourth graders answer in the United States, and is part of the Aristo Reasoning Challenge corpus released by the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. The question is, which of the following is an example of an organism taking in nutrients? And the answer is a girl eating an apple. And also note here how the negative examples have all really got good distractors to them. Each one contains an organism, like a boy or an insect or a dog. And many include things that are high associates of foods, like tomatoes or leaves. And so with these sort of complex inference questions, rarely do you get lucky enough that you're going to find a single passage in a corpus that we can just retrieve that answers the question outright. Even if your corpus is the size of the web, this is still really unlikely to happen. That here, for example, you would see a single sentence or retrieve a single sentence that said, a girl eating an apple is an example of an organism taking in nutrients. More likely, what we need to do to solve this question while producing an explanation is to aggregate a variety of different pieces of information from a variety of different sources. So we need to know that a girl means a human girl and that humans are living organisms. And we might find this information in, for example, the Simple Wiktionary. We also need to know that eating is when an organism takes in nutrients in the form of food. And this is a sentence from a study guide. And we also need to know that an apple is a kind of fruit and that fruits are foods. And so these sentences that we aggregate then form together a compelling human readable justification for why the answer is correct. And what you may have already recognized is that we can frame this as a problem of building a graph of sentences that together form an explanation that can be used to help answer the question and explain the inference behind the reasoning. Here the connections in the graph are made by lexical overlap, basically having shared words between the sentences. And so this idea of connecting multiple facts from different parts of a knowledge base to answer questions and generate explanations for the reasoning is called multi-hop inference or compositional inference or information aggregation. What isn't really immediately obvious is that in practice, performing this kind of compositional inference where we collect and meaningfully combine facts from different places to answer questions is really very challenging. It's challenging for a variety of reasons, like semantic drift, that are largely beyond the scope of sort of this very quick introduction. But behaviorally, what's important to know is that almost every contemporary algorithm out there is strongly limited in the number of textual facts that can be meaningfully combined to support the inference. And so what you tend to see is that as your inference algorithm combines more facts to answer questions, its performance goes up, peaks at some point, and then combining more facts either doesn't help or actually causes performance to decrease. Two important things to note here are, first, this pattern of progressively increasing and then decreasing performance as the number of facts being combined increases has been really observed across a wide variety of inference algorithms and representations. This seems to be something that just happens regardless of the representation or the algorithm that you choose right now. The Fried et al. Tackle paper is one example that shows us across a large number of algorithms and representations. Second, performance almost always peaks when combining 2 or at most 3 facts, and even still the increases that you get between combining 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 facts is often quite modest. And so what we seem to be getting from this is that we're really still in the infancy of being able to do this sort of information combination generally, especially using unstructured representations like free text. So we can only combine 2 or 3 facts. Maybe that's not such a big deal, right? If we want to try and find all the facts in a corpus that answer a given question and generate an explanation for the reasoning behind that answer, this task, by the way, is called the explanation regeneration task. We might be able to still do pretty well at that if we can only combine 2 or 3 facts. Here's sort of a cartoon example of multi-hop inference that fits nicely on a single slide. Again, an elementary science question. The explanation here is simple and has only 3 facts. The question is, an animal has 6 legs. What is it most likely to be? The correct answer here is a fly. And the explanation is, a fly is a kind of insect. An insect has 6 legs, and an insect is a kind of animal. So 3 facts that are all sort of lexically connected based on having shared words. Now, again, this is sort of a cartoon example because it really easily fits on a single slide. This is another example explanation that contains many more facts. And by the way, these explanations are drawn from the Worldtree multi-hop inference corpus that contains a large number of these sort of multi-hop explanations. The question here is, which of the following characteristics would best help a tree survive the heat of a forest fire? So, what characteristics help a tree survive the heat of a forest fire? The answer here is thick bark. To answer this question, the central concepts that you need to understand are that bark is a protective covering around a tree, and that thick things tend to provide more protection than thin things. But you also need to know a lot more detailed world knowledge that we often don't really think about, like that protecting something means preventing harm, that fire causes harm to living things, that trees are a kind of living thing, that protecting a living thing helps it survive, and so on. This sort of mix of scientific knowledge and detailed common sense or world knowledge, enough we sort of hope that it would make the explanations meaningful to a 5-year-old, is sort of the hallmark of the detailed explanations that are in the Worldtree corpus. The corpus has about 4,400 science exam questions paired with these sort of detailed human-authored explanations. And again, they include a mix of core scientific facts, but also that sort of detailed world knowledge, like trees are living things that you and I know, but that a computational inference algorithm really doesn't know, and so we specifically have to write it down. More important to the context of this study is that the explanations, or the facts in the explanations, come from a knowledge base of about 10,000 facts that are grounded in about 80 semi-structured tables. And so, returning to the difficulties in multi-hop inference, if we're currently able to sometimes combine 2 or 3 facts, the natural question is, how many facts do we generally need to combine in order to perform inference? The answer seems to be that even elementary and middle school science exams, so 4th grade to 8th grade, require combining an average of 6, and in some cases up to 16 facts in order to answer and explain the reasoning behind those answers. And this is particularly the case when you include that sort of detailed world knowledge that allows you to build these sort of meaningful to a 5-year-old explanations. We're sort of just at the stage where as a field we're able to build these large and expensive and detailed multi-hop explanation corpora that sort of extend beyond combining 2 facts. And that's really starting to lay bare the gap between where we are and where it'd be nice to go to emulate the reasoning of a young child in the context of combining multiple facts together. Now, of course, combining multiple facts or knowledge to perform inference isn't new at all, and methods to perform inference tend to lay on a formality continuum. On one end of the continuum, as I've sort of drawn it here, we have formal logics, theorem provers, and even more qualitative approaches like Ken Forbes's qualitative reasoning framework that really tend to model knowledge and inference as code. In the context of these ones, usually a Lisp-like dialect where the knowledge is encoded into an ontology that can be formally reasoned over. And so there's lots of very strong benefits of doing things this way. You can build very long, many-fact, provably correct, often, inference chains, particularly as you sort of crank up the formality of the approach going towards a completely logical approach. But there's also a bunch of really strong downsides. One, the approaches tend to be brittle in practice. They're often missing very small pieces of knowledge or very small axioms or steps in the inference that are critical to mend the facts together and sort of make a complete inference. And second, they also tend to require a formal ontology that's built by some very clever people and well-paid ontological engineers. And so it's very expensive to scale this approach. On the other side of the formality continuum are the sort of informal approaches that essentially use plain text as knowledge, to sort of borrow a phrase from Chris Manning's AKBC 2013 talk. And this is where a lot of the contemporary work is focused for basically all the reasons that make the formal approach a little bit less attractive. Number one, you can use plain text as knowledge in your knowledge base, and it's comparatively easy to add in more plain text into your knowledge base without requiring an ontological engineer to add it. And similarly, these techniques tend to be a little bit more robust in practice. They don't break as easily as formal approaches. But there's, of course, some really strong negatives. For example, it's currently very hard to meaningfully chain multiple plain text facts together to answer questions and perform inference. And so, as you sort of might have guessed, there exists a middle ground here where instead of using Lisp encoded ontologies or plain text, you can use a very lightly structured knowledge base, like a knowledge base of semi-structured tables. Huan Sun's table cell search and Daniel Khoshabi's table ILP are, I think, really strong contemporary examples of using this approach that people have sort of built off of. And now, rather than having sort of really obvious wins or losses, like either extreme, the semi-structured approach is really a true middle ground. The lightly structured tables are a lot easier to build than ontologies, but they're certainly not as easy as just dumping Wikipedia or a large sort of common crawl-esque corpus. You really have to get somebody to author these, but they can require a whole lot less training than an ontological engineer and usually work much faster because they're not encoding things into code. Similarly, the partial structure that you get by having sort of the different components of a fact loosely grouped into different columns of a table helps sort of compartmentalize or, lightly semantically parse the knowledge in those facts. And that helps potentially make meaningfully combining multiple facts for inference a lot easier than sort of the bare plain text case, but still much harder than in the formal approach. And so this sort of middle ground is where the CoSaTa solver and interpreter work live. And so to help ground this semi-structured approach even further, earlier we saw some multi-fact explanations represented as sort of lexically connected explanation graphs, and here this sort of lays them bare a little bit further. What I mean by lexically connected explanation graphs is that each fact in the explanation takes a row, or takes the form of a row, in a semi-structured table like we have here in the case of these sort of 3 cartoon tables. In the table store used in this work, we have about 80 tables in total, each expressing some NRE relation surrounding a particular kind of knowledge, like taxonomic knowledge, parts, process rules, changes, causality, if-then relationships, coupled relationships, sources of things, uses of things, and so forth. The structure of these was empirically derived from a large analysis that we did for culling back in 2016, and then we've had a couple of iterations of this Worldtree table store. The cartoon examples are sort of drawn here because they fit nicely on a slide, but in practice, some of these tables have dozens of columns, so you can really do this as coarsely or as finely grained as you'd like. Now here, each row in an explanation is lexically connected to the other rows, or the question, or the correct answer. And by lexically connected, I mean that it shares the same words, or at least the same lemmas, so that it forms an explicit graph, like we can sort of see here, of how the knowledge connects. And so in the example here, which event involves a consumer and a producer in a food chain, the answer is a deer eating a leaf. And we can see that the explanation here is, in a food chain process, a green plant has the role of a producer, which creates food for consumers. In the food chain process, an animal has the role of consumer and eats producers or other animals. And we can see that a deer is a kind of animal, so it fills the role of consumer. And a leaf is a part of a green plant, so it fills the role of a green plant. So this is a 4-fact explanation, which, again, it looks simple, but this is well beyond our current inference abilities to do in general, particularly with free text. But you can sort of see how you might write down a pattern that expresses how to put together sets of these facts to solve these kinds of inference problems. One possible abstraction in this particular case is that you might always grab those sort of top 2 rows about producers and consumers, and then just fill in particular kinds of animals or particular kinds of plants from other tables. And in that way, you could use such a pattern to answer similar questions, regardless of whether they're talking about deer or rabbits or giraffes. And so that's sort of what CoSaTa is all about. However you've abstracted a given pattern of inference, whether it's the abstraction that I've just given you or one that's much higher or lower level, to solve some subset of questions, CoSaTa, and the idea behind it is that it gives you this sort of really easy interpreted language and quick and robust way to express that pattern in code and start to apply it. So here is a high-level overview of CoSaTa and its different components. CoSaTa is designed for inference over knowledge bases of semi-structured tables. Sometimes we call these table stores. And so you either need to download or author a knowledge base of tables. There's a bunch available right now. And if your table rows can readily be read off as plain text sentences, such as the ones in Worldtree or the Aristo table store can be, then they can be annotated by CoreNLP, which makes matching much more robust later on. And so you, as an inference engineer, then can quickly write rules in the CoSaTa scripting language that are essentially constraint satisfaction patterns over tables. And these patterns define valid ways of knowledge connecting between tables based on shared content in their cells. We'll see some examples of these in a few minutes, and there's certainly a bunch of examples in the paper. But the sort of cartoon one here describes changes of state of matter, so things like melting or boiling or freezing. The CoSaTa solver reads in these constraint satisfaction patterns that you've authored and finds all possible solutions of them in the knowledge base. And then these can either be exported for further downstream processing, for example, as a JSON that you can import into your machine learning model and use to perform inference. And we have some examples of the 5-fact solutions for this sort of change of state pattern shown down here in the solver output. In the context of the idea of ice melting, which is an example that we have on this slide, one of the 5-fact solutions that we have for this change of state pattern is fact number 1, solid water is called ice. Fact number 2, liquid water is called liquid water. Fact number 3, melting changes from a solid to a liquid. Fact number 4, melting requires heat. And fact number 5, liquids have variable shape. Similarly, right beside it is the same, or is a solution for the same pattern, but in this case it enumerates for boiling rather than for melting. So the solver is standalone, and it's designed to be very easily integrated with other systems. But CoSaTa doesn't stop there. It has sort of these two components. One, the constraint satisfaction solver, and number two, it has this sort of interpreted language that actually allows you the ability to write very small amounts of imperative code that sort of pair with these declarative constraint satisfaction problems or constraint satisfaction patterns. That allows you to actually experiment with executing very sort of minimally specified micro simulations that support question answering. So for example, the example question here asks what might happen to an ice cube left out in the sunlight. You can simulate a common ice cube being taken out of the freezer and left outside, and how its temperature will ultimately raise and cause it to change from a solid to a liquid through melting. And so at sort of this very high level, question answering is a field that's seeing this very productive transition right now from models that simply supply answers to questions to a shift towards models that supply explanations for those answers. The idea here being that it helps build user trust, it helps make the results more interpretable and more easily able to be evaluated by a human. While this is really useful, one of the potential problems with textual explanations is that they're not proofs, right? So something might still sound reasonable, but it could be incorrect. I think ultimately this shift towards explanation-centered inference is going to come back full circle to trying to build simulations, really small sort of micro simulations for those inferences. And this work here with CoSaTa, and certainly on the interpreter side of things, is an exploration at trying to make it easier by building simulations that are mostly supported by a knowledge base, and knowledge that's in a semi-structured knowledge base of tables, rather than in detailed and expensive ontologies like we've seen in past work. Two final notes before moving on to the tool demonstration. The first, and I won't belabor this much because it's in the paper and in the examples, but this is an example piece of CoSaTa code that runs in the interpreter that builds a simulation for the question about what happens to an ice cube when you leave it out of the freezer. It's only 9 lines of CoSaTa code, though. Notably, that doesn't include the code for authoring the inference patterns underneath it that it uses, like heat transfer or changes of state. But what we see here is that the script defines 3 objects in a very sort of minimally specified simulation. There's an ice cube, there's a freezer, and there's the environment outside the freezer. And these objects inherit most of their properties like temperature and location and melting point, etc., from the knowledge base of tables rather than from sort of a formal ontology. And so the ice cube starts out being cold, the same temperature as the freezer, and then it's moved to the outside environment. It progressively warms up by calling the heat transfer inference pattern until it reaches a temperature where some solution to the change of state inference pattern is available. It turns out that a valid solution to that change of state in that context is melting, and that the change of state inference pattern, once you execute it, changes the ice cube from a solid into a liquid. And so we can answer the question and have this nice, simple record of a situation described by the question, as well as what happened and exactly why it happened, so we can really support our answer to this question through simulation. And the very final note here, before moving on, is that the CoSaTa interpreter is potentially very powerful, but it's still really a research language that takes time to devote to learning, a really uncommon way of coding where you sort of have declarative and imperative code mixed together, that further sort of directly couples with a knowledge base and declarative constraint patterns. And it's a really fun way to code and very powerful, but it takes a bit of time to learn. The CoSaTa constraint satisfaction solver is standalone and probably more applicable for most end users. And it's really easy and intuitive to pick up the scripting language, and has some really nice robust features for making patterns over text, like robustness to lemma forms or the ability to search for parts of speech. So you can really be up and running and creating patterns in text in likely just a few minutes. So it's really quite powerful and useful. To sort of demonstrate that, the table here from the paper shows that if you combine sets of these inference pattern solutions together, specifically a set of curated multi-hop inference patterns that were distributed with the Worldtree version 2 corpus, plus some additional patterns that we've authored, your ceiling performance for actually regenerating detailed gold explanations in the Worldtree corpus is up to 78% when you combine up to 3 of the solutions that CoSaTa enumerates for you. And this is actually ceiling performance for a short list of ranked solutions. I think in this particular case, we're looking at the top 5 solutions for each of the 385 inference patterns that were in this study. And so the search space is really comparatively small compared to trying to pick out half a dozen single facts on average, and as many as 16 facts, remember, from a knowledge base of 10,000 facts that just happen to be meaningfully combined. So this really slims down your search space quite a bit with these sort of high confidence patterns that are generated by your inference patterns here. And with that, on to the demo and going through a few examples. So in this second half of the tool demonstration, we're going to look at how to actually use the constraint satisfaction solver tool and interpreter, both in the context of sort of a hello world example or a series of examples and how to run those on the command line, as well as a quick look at sort of the integrated development environment that we sort of prototyped here. So recall that CoSaTa is a constraint satisfaction solver that operates over semi-structured tables of sentences or text. And here's an example of a sort of really bare table store that we just sort of have here as a test. And we're looking here at a taxonomic table, or a table that expresses taxonomic information. So for example here, that a solid is a kind of state of matter, or a liquid or a gas is also a kind of state of matter, that a fridge is a kind of cooling device, that a horse is a kind of animal, blue is a kind of color, and so on and so forth. This table store is designed to be sort of easy to view and easy to sort of tinker with or experiment with. Your table store can have as much structure or as little structure as you'd like. If you look at this is the Worldtree table store, you can see that it includes many more tables. There's about 80 tables here, and many of them are very densely structured. So for example, this coupled relationship table, so as X or Y increases, Z also increases or decreases, for example, has here over 20 columns. So that's quite a bit more structure than something more simple like a taxonomic table. You might also automatically read these tables in or automatically generate these tables from an information extraction tool. And in that case, the amount of structure you're likely to get is really going to be very little. So for example, if you're using OpenIE triples, you're probably just going to get sort of something that looks like an SVO triple, subject, a relation, or a verb, and an object. And so I've made a quick table here called SVO that gives a couple examples of things that you might see, where you have, for example, a red cat sees an orange dog, a blue hedgehogs catch rings, a light orange dog eats dog food, and so on and so forth, just as sort of an example for us to play with. And the other table that we'll look at here is the part of table. So X is a part of Y, a generator is a part of a power station, and a wall is a part of a room, are the two example rows that we have in this one. And so what I'd like to do first is sort of go through the hello world example of writing a constraint satisfaction pattern. This sort of demo file here of examples has a bunch of different constraint satisfaction patterns that are almost exclusively patterns that are operating in the constraint satisfaction mode. So there's very little code going on here. And if we look at the first pattern here, what we basically see is that it's a pattern that looks for two table rows. Those rows are named tax1 and tax2. You can name these anything. And those rows are going to come from the kind of table. And we're going to look for a row called tax1, and whatever the content of the hypernym column is, we're going to call that a variable, x. And similarly, whatever the content of the hypernym column is, we're going to call that a variable, y. Now for the second taxonomic row, we're going to want to switch the order of these variables a little bit. So the hyponym is going to be y, and the hypernym is going to be something new, a new variable called z. And so what this is going to match on are rows that have the form x is a kind of y, and then y is a kind of z. So for example, a hummingbird is a kind of bird, and a bird is a kind of animal. So the idea of taxonomic inheritance here. So I'm going to run this, and here the interpreter can just be run on the command line, which is sort of the main way that it would normally be run. It's written in Scala, so you use SBT to invoke it here, as we have in this script. And I'm just going to run this script here, and the interpreter SBT loads up the project. Then it will quickly annotate the table store and runs all of the patterns that are in this file, and it's done. The output of the interpreter in this mode, in the constraint satisfaction mode, is a series of output files. And so we have output files that are in sort of a human readable form, an HTML file that we'll look at in a second. We have a JSON that you can use to import the solutions to the constraint satisfaction patterns in your own code. And then there's a few other debug files that sort of help you get a sense of what's going on, particularly the table store file that's particularly helpful. So the JSON file here gives us sort of our example pattern and then solutions to that pattern, so specific rows. So for example, this one is boiling is a kind of change of state or phase change, and a change of state or phase change is a kind of physical change. It also, so those are our two rows, but it also gives us variables and their values. So we had x, y, and z as variables here, and their values are boil, change of state, and physical change in this example pattern. But probably a little bit easier to read is the HTML output of the CoSaTa solver, which is intended for you to debug patterns very quickly and easily. So this is a little bit more human readable. Here we have the first match of our sort of example hello world taxonomic inheritance pattern, and we see those two rows that we were just looking at. Boiling is a kind of change of state, a change of state is a kind of physical change, and we see the x, y, and z variables as they've been instantiated here. We can sort of just randomly scroll down here and see other examples. So an oven is a kind of heating device, a heating device is a kind of device, and how those variables instantiate. Fridge is a kind of home appliance, a home appliance is a kind of wall-powered device. These are all examples from the example table store. A kitchen is a kind of room, a room is a kind of artificial environment, and so on and so on. So that's our first example pattern, and there's a number of other example patterns that have been enumerated here that I'd like to quickly go through. So this pattern, next pattern here, is the idea of part inheritance. So if x is a kind of y and y has a given part, then x might also have that part. So for example, if x is a kind of room, so for example, a kitchen is a kind of room, and rooms have walls, then a kitchen might also have a wall. And so in this particular example here, we have the first taxonomic row, or the taxonomic row, the hyponym and the hypernym, just as we had before. Then we have a part of row that basically says, look in our part of table, and if there's any holes listed in the part of table that are the hyponym, basically this y here, then grab their part name and assign that a variable. And there's a little bit of code that's attached down here too. So this is an example of having a declarative pattern that also has imperative code. But we'll just sort of hold on to this for a second and see what happens without the imperative code. So if we look at here, we get lots of sort of engineered examples of this, right? So a kitchen is a kind of room, a wall is a part of a room, and the variable assignments. A living room is a kind of room, a wall is part of a room, and so on. There's only a couple of these things that have been put in this example table store. A solar farm is a kind of power station, a generator is a part of a power station, nuclear power plant, generator, and so on and so forth. So these are sort of the examples that we get out of this. Now we can actually run these and include imperative code, and I'm not going to go over most of the imperative parts of CoSaTa in this short demo just because it would take a little bit too long to go through those. But for those, you're going to want to have a look at the example code that's included in the distribution. But if we look at the table store output that CoSaTa gives us, this is the table store as CoSaTa sees it. And in our example table store, we just have those two part of rows, that a generator is a part of a power station, and that a wall is a part of a room. These are lemmas, by the way. This is rendered as lemmas. So we only have these two rows. But now, for this inference pattern here, we can say, or we can ask CoSaTa, for any solutions that you enumerate or find of this pattern, you can generate a new row in the table store that says that the part in the part of table is populated by the part name variable, and that the whole is populated by the x variable. So now, if we know that a kitchen is a kind of room and that walls are parts of rooms, we'll explicitly enumerate that a kitchen has a wall. And so there's two execution modes in CoSaTa. The main mode of execution is for the micro simulations where you actually explicitly run solutions. But there is a new execution mode where you can sort of have these just automatically run on their own. So I'm going to uncomment that and run the interpreter again. And what this will do is it'll automatically populate the solutions, or automatically run all of the solutions of this particular inference pattern, so that when we go and have a look at the part of, or at the table store again, we have a whole bunch of new rows that have automatically been generated by the solver here. So we now explicitly know that a wall is a part of a kitchen, and a wall is a part of a bedroom, and a generator is a part of a wind farm or a geothermal power plant, or so on. So that's another example. Let's move on a little bit here to some more powerful examples, and examples that are still simple but show some of the features that allow you to get a little bit more power in your expressions, where CoSaTa sort of handles things behind the scenes. So this particular pattern here is going to look for animals in our SVO table. So something, for example, that might be output from an OpenIE extraction tool, where what you're looking for is for a single cell to have more structure in it. Specifically, you're looking for things that mention color names and animal names. So again, this is a toy example, so things like blue giraffes or orange cats and things of that nature. And so how you express that here is using expressions to match the content of particular column names. So here in the subject column, we're looking for the content of that column to have two different variables in it, color name and animal name. The problem here is that a single cell can have any number of words in it, right? It could have 0 words or tokens, or it could have 10 words or tokens. And so here what CoSaTa does is it automatically enumerates all of the possible spans that a variable could take when you have multiple variables or multiple expression terms being matched in a given cell. And so here, it's looking for a color name that happens to be listed as a color explicitly in the kind of table. And similarly, it's going to look for an animal that happens to be listed explicitly as an animal in the hyponym table. But here it won't matter if the animal name or the color name happen to be single tokens or multiple tokens. It'll automatically sort of figure those out. And as we have a quick peek at the output, what we see here, this is our third pattern, is that it does exactly what we'd expect. So for example, a red cat sees an orange dog. Red is a kind of color and a cat is a kind of animal. So this is sort of the simple example where each one is a single token. Blue hedgehogs, blue is a kind of animal, a hedgehog is a kind of animal. Blue is a kind of color, a hedgehog is a kind of animal. Note here, something is happening that's not immediately obvious, but we're actually doing matching across lemma forms rather than, or word or lemma forms, rather than just sort of doing string matching here. And this is one of the sort of robustnesses that you get from having something that's doing annotation and underneath, so that if your tables are expressed with slightly different surface forms, you still get robustness to matching that you don't generally get with other solvers. Similarly down here, here we've automatically determined the span of this variable to be 2 tokens long. So a light orange dog, where light orange is a kind of color. And the opposite example here, so an African giraffe, so a longer span than just a single word. So quickly buzzing through a couple of other examples here. You might have noticed light orange giraffe and explicitly coding the idea that a light or that light orange is a kind of color. That's not a very efficient way of doing things. Usually want to know that orange is a kind of color and then have a modifier on orange. And so the next example pattern here allows you to have an optional adjective modifier on the front of that expression. So light orange, dark blue, what have you, you're going to match it without any trouble. And then sort of lastly here, the CoSaTa solver allows your patterns, your inference patterns that you have here, to be basically inherited from other patterns, so that you can use good software engineering practices to decompose or abstract your problem into smaller pieces and then compose larger wholes or larger composite patterns from those smaller pieces. As again, a toy example of this, here we have an example pattern that matches animals that have a particular color, but in this case, it'll restrict it to just animals that have primary colors. And so what we do in this case is that we inherit all of the rows from the earlier pattern, but then we also include an additional row in this pattern that's explicitly looking for rows that are in the kind of table that are listed not just as colors, but are listed as primary colors. And then we merge these two patterns together, the current pattern that we're working on and the inherited pattern, by including some additional constraints like we have here. The idea that whatever the color name in the inherited pattern was, it has to match the variable that stores the primary color name in this particular pattern. And so you see when this happens, we end up getting matches that are just on primary colors. So the red cat here, this is the inherited pattern down here, and the the primary or the rows that are associated with the current pattern, the primary color, are up here, and all of the variables that you get are in this composite pattern are listed down here. So you can see that some of these variables are inherited, while the primary color name, is a part of the sort of base form of the pattern. And again, so we have a red cat, and we have a blue hedgehog and a blue African giraffe that these match on. Now, just one or two last quick examples of these sort of hello world patterns. In some cases, it's useful not to do strict matching on strings of text so that you get robustness. We've seen an example of that here already, where instead of matching on verb or on word surface forms only, you can match on lemma forms and be robust to that sort of variation in language. Similarly, sometimes you want to match on part of speech tags, which we've already seen, but sometimes you don't care about order. And so the tilde here allows us to do sort of bag of words matching instead of sort of strict word order matching. And so in this particular case, we're going to look for any SVO or any rows from the SVO table whose subject includes one adjective in any position, is what this says. And a different example where you have words instead of tags here is where you're going to match for rows that have the words giraffe and blue in any order in the subject column. And so this last bit here we see, here are the patterns that have any adjective, so red, blue, light, blue, bright, heavy, and so on. And then down here we have the pattern where we're looking for giraffe and blue in any order, and of course here blue African giraffe is a mixed order compared to how we've entered it. Okay, so those are sort of the very quick examples, the hello world examples of coding up patterns in this sort of very simple but very powerful constraint satisfaction language, running them through the interpreter and getting the output as you would here. The paper includes a number of examples of larger constraint satisfaction patterns that were taken from the Worldtree version 2 that has sort of these large patterns that aren't really executable. And so as just sort of a very brief example of what larger patterns look like, here's one of those, or here are a couple of those patterns. This particular one is a pattern that talks about how given seasons have certain amounts of daylight. So for example, you get a lot of daylight in the winter, or you get a small amount of daylight in the winter and a large amount of daylight in the summer, and that has to deal with the tilt of Earth's axis. You're either, depending on which hemisphere you're on, you're either tilted towards or away from the sun, and that affects the amount of daylight that you get. And so this is sort of a real example, not a toy example, of combining a fairly large number of rows together with a fairly large set of variables that all have to match together in order to enumerate. And we include a bunch of these. These are the ones that I've actually gone through and hand fixed. We're trying to work on automatically doing this, but it's actually quite challenging. So, and just as an example of some solutions of those patterns, here is an example of we have change of state patterns. Here's our daylight by season pattern, where these are actual enumerations of this pattern or solutions of this pattern. You can see they're quite large. This one has 13 rows in it. So if you're thinking in terms of multi-hop inference patterns where we're having trouble aggregating 2 or even 3 facts together. This one has 13 that are all melded together very solidly and very meaningfully. So that's where some of the power of this approach comes, where you can just put things together with very minimal effort. So you can see here the Earth being tilted on its axis causes one side of the Earth to receive less energy from the sun than the other side. The summer solstice is on June 21st in the northern hemisphere. Earth being tilted on its axis causes seasons. The amount of daylight is greatest in the summer. This one here was an optional row that wasn't populated because there wasn't a match in this particular case. Summer is when a hemisphere is tilted towards the sun. The amount of daylight is greatest in the summer. When a season changes, the amount of daylight will change. When a hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, that hemisphere receives more direct sunlight. When sunlight strikes something, it receives that sunlight. The equator receives the most direct sunlight throughout the year. The equator has a constant number of daylight hours. The Earth rotates on its tilted axis, and the Earth revolves around the sun. So these are all these are patterns that enumerate on these table rows, and you end up with different solutions to a particular pattern. That instead of talking about summer, it'll talk about winter. Instead of talking about being in the northern hemisphere, it'll talk about being in the southern hemisphere, or it'll have different solstices and so on and so forth. Maybe a way that's a little bit more intuitive, because we usually don't think about summer solstices and so on and so forth, is sort of the follow-through example in the paper, the idea of changes of state: melting, boiling, freezing. So here's a change of state pattern that has 13 rows in it, and that includes all of the sort of really nitty-gritty details of world knowledge of what you need to know about state changes. So boiling means matter changes from a liquid to a gas by increasing heat energy. This is sort of one of the main rows. A phase changes when matter changes from one state of matter to another. Temperature is a property of objects. The boiling point means the temperature that liquids boil, and so on and so on and so forth, all the way down to a gas is a kind of state of matter, a liquid is a kind of state of matter, the actors in this sort of change, that boiling is a kind of process, that temperature is a measure of heat energy, and so on and so forth. And so this is a boiling example, this is a melting example. As we sort of go down the list, we get different examples with slightly different enumerations to them. Melting, and so on and so forth. The reason why we get so many enumerations is that the constraint satisfaction solver allows us, here's condensing, allows optional fields and whatnot to make things more robust, and sometimes those optional fields match and other times they don't. Okay, so I sort of hinted at the IDE that I was showing here, and I'm going to buzz through this a little bit quickly, in part because the font size can't be enlarged a great deal, so we can't see too much of it on this video. It is intended for very large monitors. But what you've probably gotten here is that in order to do this with, in order to do this constraint satisfaction solver process with sort of just the constraint satisfaction mode, you're probably going to be okay with whatever workflow you have. I tend to love doing it with sort of a Google Sheets workflow for the table store, where you have an automatic downloader script that just sort of grabs the table store in 10 seconds. And dumps it into a tab delimited text file. And then you can just write code in whatever or scripts in whatever you're most comfortable with, and you run it on the command line, and away you go. And keeping things on Google Sheets allows people to sort of collaboratively work on this. If you're using CoSaTa in sort of the micro simulation form, then you tend to have a lot of balls up in the air all at the same time. There's a lot that you have to worry about. You have all of these inference patterns that execute code that make changes on the simulation. You have a knowledge base on which that code intimately depends. And so you need to know when problems exist in that knowledge base as quickly as possible, and be able to make modifications to it very quickly. and so on and so forth. There's just sort of a lot that you have to keep in mind, and the sort of all the power that you get from that language ends up being extra mental effort that's put on the user. And so if you can offload most of that mental effort onto a development environment, then you can sort of be very, very productive in it. And so this tool here, which this prototype was developed under contract, is an example of, can we do this? Can we use an interpreted language that incorporates these hybrid declarative and imperative parts and constraint satisfaction paradigms into actually being able to productively do this? And the answer, thankfully, is yes. I'll give you a quick sort of overview of this prototype tool. So you can either create a new project or open up a new project. I already have a bunch of demo stuff open here. This tab has sort of the bare code, so you can just sort of run and modify, or sort of modify code. You can't run it here. Specifically those constraint satisfaction patterns. And so, for example, in the context of the sort of ice melting follow-through example in the paper, here are some changes of state of matter where you have real CoSaTa code that isn't sort of cartoony code. In this particular case, you have a change of state of matter that tells you that it's a substance changing from one state to another. You have a set of requirements, like that it takes an object that is a kind of substance. That substance should have a state of matter and a temperature populated, and so on and so forth. And then for the declarative solutions that it's able to populate, here is what they look like. Now, this particular pattern here doesn't have any code attached to it. But if we go down to some of the other examples here, we end up with, this is an inherited example. So we have a change of state of matter that describes the generic idea of changing states of matter. And then we have two substances in changes of state of matter. One has an extra phase transition point on it, which is basically a collection of rows that say substance X, say water, happens to be in a particular state, say a liquid. And if it wants to change state, here are the collection of phase transition points. So a melting point and a boiling point. And then what the code basically does here is, if this pattern is executed, if there's a solution to it, and if that solution is executed, it implements that change. So it would take water that had, for example, gone above 100 degrees Celsius and change its state of matter property from a liquid to a gas. Other slightly more complicated examples here of the declarative code. So here's an example of a heat transfer inference pattern, and it's a heat transfer going from an environment to an object. This one takes two objects as sort of parameters that are passed to it. One is an object, so a physical object. The other one is a particular kind of environment. And they should each have some temperature associated with them. Now, the constraint pattern here is really simple. It uses the knowledge base essentially like a knowledge base, and it looks for only a single row, letting you know that, that the thing, the object, is in the environment. So for example, the ice cube is in the kitchen environment, or the ice cube is in the outside environment, or so on and so forth. And if that happens, then it implements a change. And this change, or it can implement a change, I should say, if it's executed. And that change is essentially, it checks the temperature of both of the objects, the object and the environment, and it either transfers heat from the object to the environment or transfers heat from the environment to the object, depending on which one is warmer, so that they sort of equalize into temperature. I note here, this is more qualitative reasoning in that the particular kind of heat transfer here doesn't incorporate mass, although you could incorporate thermal mass into this calculation if you'd like. But it's sort of more qualitative reasoning in that it's, if you're making a model, is it good enough to use this sort of inference pattern for the kind of inference that you're doing? And certainly at an elementary science level, this is good enough. But if you wanted to make one that was more complicated, then you can do that without any trouble. So this imperative code block looks a lot like pretty much any other language that you would have seen, if statements, assignments, and whatnot. For some of these patterns that implement changes that are sort of small changes that might be run iteratively, it actually includes a temporal model that allows you to make tiny steps. So you can run the simulation in tiny steps, and the object, for example, can progressively get hotter and hotter and hotter. Or you can run it sort of as eventually what will happen, so that you skip over all of that simulation and you can just have something that basically says, if an object is left in an environment for long enough, the object is going to have that temperature of the environment to a first approximation. Okay, so the IDE also includes sort of a table editor. This is just a sort of a standard table editing widget. Because so many patterns tend to inherit or tend to require knowing something as a kind of something else in order to work properly, there is a graphical taxonomy editor here that allows you to sort of do this a little bit easier than you might otherwise do it by editing tables, so that you can know, for example, that Venus is a kind of object and whatnot. And it does incorporate the idea of multiple inheritance, so something can be a kind of more than one thing. And sort of the last bit here that I'll show is sort of the example, follow-through example from the paper where you're actually using CoSaTa to make these sort of micro simulations. And this sort of split screen form that we have here, on one side we have a control script. So this control script basically says, I'm going to run a simulation, instantiate a couple of objects that we're going to use in the simulation, and then here's the inference patterns that you should execute to make that simulation happen. This is the ice cube example. The real question from the ARC corpus is, a student removes an ice cube tray from the freezer and places it on a table. The ice cubes are solid and cold. The student forgets to put the ice cube tray back in the freezer. The next day, the object should be liquid and warmer. And so the CoSaTa code in the control script is displayed over here on the right-hand side, and we see that we can instantiate the object, which is the ice cube, the freezer, and the table, which is sort of seen as the outside environment. And then we can give the substances common properties and set their initial temperature and their environment. And then we can move the ice cube from the freezer to the outside environment. And then we can run the heat transfer inference pattern that's going to progressively let heat transfer happen between the object and the environment until the requirements for some solution to the change of state inference pattern happens. And once those requirements are met, it will run that change of state inference pattern on the object. And that object in this particular case will change from a solid to a liquid. It will melt. On the other side here is the basic export of the simulation here. And so what we end up having is a numbered list of states. You can give these names if you'd like. You have all of the objects that are in the simulation. So here the list of property value pairs. So we have a freezer that has a location and a name and a temperature. An object that we care about, which here I've just called test object 1, that's a kind of ice cube and has an inherited material of ice. and an outside environment, which here is the kitchen, which is at 22 degrees. We can see that as we execute things, we add or change the properties of the objects until ultimately the ice cube becomes very cold by being placed in the freezer. Then it's moved to the outside environment, and then heat transfer happens between the ice cube, and it progressively warms up and goes warmer and warmer. We're at -7, -4, -1, and then it raises over the melting point and then changes the state of matter. So a very simple microsimulation in that context. So that concludes this demonstration of the CoSaTa tool and the integrated development environment. And we'll be including some additional documentation that allows us to have a better understanding of the language and the commands that are available to it and whatnot over the next couple of months. Thank you.